Brilliant. Can you see? If you can't see, how do we see? Thank you.
You press that button.
Brilliant. Thank you. So, thanks very much. So yeah, my name is Ellesse and I am a student at the University of Edinburgh. I am just now in my third year of the PhD, which is absolutely terrifying, but here we are. And my PhD looks at more of the social science aspect of conservation, specifically looking at opinions and attitudes of conservation. So before I start, just really quickly, I want you to just think about what you think conservation is and how you think conservation should be carried out to be most successful. I'm not going to ask you to shout out, so don't worry, but just keep these things in mind as we go through and reflect on them as and when. So first of all, what is an attitude? Well, in conservation, a lot of the words like opinions and attitudes and perceptions get thrown around and they don't really have much continuity to them. So using psychology theory, we're going to define attitudes so we really know what it is that we're looking at. So an attitude is someone's internal evaluation to an issue or an object, and it's either positive or negative. For example, if we use this red squirrel, someone might have the attitude that they love red squirrels, they're amazing and they're totally in love with them. But this attitude is built on different things, so it has foundations that reside in core values, beliefs, and one's internal evaluation. So if someone loves red squirrels, this could be built on their evaluation that they're just really pretty. And this is due to their belief that red squirrels could have little tufts on their ears, whereas grey squirrels have round ears. Now that is all subjective to one's imagination, and it could align with their value of they want to live in a world of beauty. So these are all the things that can influence someone's attitude. Now attitudes are quite complex things, and some can be weak and some can be quite strong. The weak attitudes, that they're really easy, not easy, but they're easier to kind of influence and educate and change, whereas the more complex ones are more set in stone, and we can't really change these, but we can navigate them. So if an attitude has a vertical structure, like we can see here, so it's based on one or two maybe core values, and it looks like a column, that is what we call a rather weak attitude. Whereas a complex and strong attitude is based on multiple values and multiple different belief systems as well. So like I said, not that it's impossible to change someone's attitude, but they're quite hard to navigate these complex ones, as there's lots of different issues, like cultural, life experiences that builds up to make this attitude. So with that in mind, we're going to think about why attitudes are important in conservation. And to be honest, why do we really care what someone's attitude in conservation is? So someone's attitude towards conservation can influence the success of any kind of project or initiative, both positively and negatively, which is why they're so important. So a few things why people can influence conservation success. If someone has strong attitudes either to, like pro or cons, they can influence success of organisations by increasing support, let's say through volunteering, through donations and funding, but also the opposite of that, so they can withdraw funding as well. They can withdraw their on-the-ground support. We can also influence it by awareness and outreach and large-scale activism. I'm sure you've all seen the Extinction Rebellion and raising awareness of these kind of issues. And ultimately, when attitudes are really strong, either for or against, they can even influence voting, decision-making and policy design. So this is why it's really important to understand what people think about conservation, especially in localised areas and for small organisations as well. And knowing what people think about these initiatives can help with conflict mitigation, which is a real important part, and it's the part that we're aiming for and what I'll talk about in this session today. So to cut a long story very short, my research group at the University of Edinburgh and elsewhere were approached by the Royal Society of Wildlife Trusts. So the guy in charge of data, called Dan, he wanted to kind of make this large nationwide survey to really understand what the Wildlife Trust members thought about conservation as a whole, and how the Wildlife Trusts conserve local areas as well. And our main research questions that we shared, so what attitudes do people have towards conservation and how do they think it should be carried out? And really more importantly, one of my research aims for my PhD is, can we create a tool to measure this? And can we make it available to use by other organisations such as the RSPB or the National Trust. So, to do this, we developed something called the Great Big Nature Survey. So, like I said, this survey aimed to uncover different conservation attitudes, primarily for the Wildlife Trust members and staff at first, with a greater aim of, giving that to wider communities and, more representative samples in the future. So to start with, we hypothesised lots of different potential attitudes in our research group. So this was done by really comprehensive literature reviews, lots of workshops, and by expert-led workshops, I mean we all got together over Zoom for day-long meetings on end, just chatting about previous research that our group had carried out and what was already available in the literature. I was really lucky that my research group is well established and had already done a similar kind of survey, but based on conservation professionals. So we had at least some kind of base to work off as well. So we identified 7 potential attitudes that we thought that people or the general public, non-experts, might have towards the way that conservation is carried out. And I'll get to these a bit later. Once we identified these attitudes, we then sat down and thought about some statements that would correspond both agree and disagreement with these attitudes, just to get a nice range, and they would be the statements that we used in our survey. So once we had all our attitudes and our statements, which were 91 statements, we sat down and could actually get to the design part of the survey. So we used a psychometric scale approach to our survey, which basically means we used Likert scales. We put a statement out and we had different agreement charts from strongly disagree all the way to agree. And we also had some different boxes for I don't understand or I have some conflicts with this question too. Now, because this is for non-experts, I wanted to make it as available and inclusive as possible. So I analysed each statement using something called a FLESH score, which for those who aren't familiar, it basically looks at the number of letters per word and then adds up that per words per sentence, does some fancy division, and it gives you a score from 0 to 100. 0 being no one can understand and read it, and 100 being it's very easy to understand. And we were aiming for about 60 to 70 on this score, so we wanted it to be really understandable while still maintaining the original, context of the question. Once I had that score, I then converted it into a reading age. Again, being that inclusive, we wanted everyone to be able to take part and understand, and we wanted the statements to reflect the UK national reading age. Does anyone know what that is, by the way? 9 years old. So the UK national reading age is 9 years old, so yeah, we really wanted to make these statements easy to understand, and that actually was quite difficult because we couldn't use words like conservation or stuff, so we had to really try and make it easy but maintain the context. So it was a challenge, but we did it. So once we had our lovely survey ready to go, it was time for the pilot stage, and this was disseminated through the Wildlife Trust channels, which we're really thankful for. Initially, it was done through staff and members and volunteers, just so we could have people give their thoughts and feedback and we could run some initial data. So I collected a total of 801 different survey responses, and then we did some follow-up interviews as well, which were 44. And again, just assessed what people answered, did it align with our original hypotheses, and mainly were the questions easy to understand, did the survey go down well or not, what could we change? So after that pilot stage and we did our analysis, we used something called exploratory factor analysis to identify these attitudes. So what this basically does is it groups, but per person it groups their responses to their statements, agree or disagree, and it puts them into little groups or clusters called dimensions. And from those dimensions we can see all the statements that correlate with each other and then kind of propose attitudes based on that. And then we can see if those proposed attitudes fit what our hypothesized attitudes were. It also helps us identify statements which are redundant, so statements that have no correlation with anything. And using this kind of analysis, we got our original statements set down from 91 to 25, which all our respondents were very happy to hear about for the final launch of the survey. So because we don't have much time, I'll go through the kind of survey very, very quickly, just to give you an idea of what it entailed. So it kind of looked like this. So we had a statement, of course, 91. We had statements, and then, a scale of disagree to agree. And then at the end, we had these little comments here. So I'm not sure what this means, and I have concerns. Again, all based on inclusivity and being as understandable as possible, and also to mitigate conflict. We had some, I'm going to use the word dodgy, we had some dodgy statements in there that caused a bit of riffraff. So statements such as that the population should be controlled to help nature, which are not reflections of the Wildlife Trust, but sometimes taken as reflections of the Wildlife Trust. And obviously that's not what we wanted to do, so we wanted to make sure there was no conflicts at all and everyone was quite happy. So our results looked a bit like this, which is chaos, but you can understand how we have quite different polarising statements. Some have everyone agreeing, some have everyone disagreeing, and then some in the middle that kind of, it's both sides, it depends. And that's the bit that we really want to understand. So what makes someone think that they have this attitude? So again, just really quick going on about that, I'll get to the attitude section. So these are our hypothesised attitudes, so the attitudes that we originally, based our questions off. So again, when I said at the start, think about how you perceive conservation and what you think it should be and how it should be successful. See if you relate to any of these. So our first one was anthropocentric conservation. And if you are an anthropocentric conservationist, you think that conservation action should first and foremost prioritise human well-being. So we should conserve nature because it helps humans first and foremost, and secondary because it helps wildlife. We also have science-led attitudes. I'm sure many of you might agree with this one, that science and scientific evidence should be the main driver in making conservation decisions. Animal rights. If you're an animal rights attitude, you think that the welfare of animals and individual animals should be prioritised over conserving ecological wholes. So we don't want to do any harm to any animal at all in conservation, whether it helps the ecosystem or not. Similarly, we have social justice, but this is different to anthropocentric. So social justice conservationists prioritise issues of social justice, so they don't want anyone to be disadvantaged, especially local communities who are at the forefront of conservation. If we are reflooding an area, we don't want the people living there to be at any kind of disadvantage. We have market conservationists, which was originally called conservation through capitalism, but that got a bit iffy. So we changed it to market-orientated conservation. And yeah, the clue's in the name. So this is people who think that conservation will only be successful if it works with our current economy, if it makes money, and if corporations are involved. Passive conservationists, humans should step back and just leave nature to itself. So if we want nature to thrive, nature will thrive by itself. It doesn't need us to do that for it. And finally, process-led conservationists. So if you are a process-led conservationist, you think that conservation should maintain the way nature works, so the ecological processes, rather than focusing on a species level or an ecosystem level. So as long as nature is doing all the natural things it needs to do and everything's in balance, it's okay if some things go extinct. So these were the 7 hypothesised attitudes that we have. Like I say, some of you might agree with some of these, some of you might really disagree with some of these. But these are just what we gathered from the literature and from past research. Now, with the results from our survey, from our pilot survey, we found all these attitudes except one. So the only attitude that we did not see evidence of was that process-led conservation. Now, we're not sure if this is because of our sample size. I mean, we had 800 people, but they were all biased towards liking conservation anyway. I mean, they were all members of the Wildlife Trust for a start, so that can bias things. And we also have to think about research error too. So at the end of the day, we did the research, we made the statements. Did we make it as easy to understand as possible? Or does this attitude just simply not exist? And that is all going to be found out in our latest launch. So the Great Big Nature Survey official number 1 was launched last March. And so far we have over 12,000 responses, which I need to go through, and that's going to take a long time, so bear with us for the results of that. And our next steps are, again, to analyse using exploratory factor analysis again, but with this large sample, and to then run a confirmation factor analysis too, which then kind of fits it into our proposed attitudes, and we get a figure of like how well it fits. What my job is after that is to conduct a spatial analysis of the Wildlife Trust members. And this is something that I really want to do, and I think it's really important, because there's 46 different wildlife trusts, so within those constituencies, there's going to be unique member bases, and we can see what attitudes are most prevalent in each of those little constituencies. That can then help the wildlife trust in that area with their communications, with conflict mitigation, and just getting more support overall. Looking to the future, I want to make that on a bigger scale. So once we have this, solid and robust survey that we know works, we can give it out to more members of the public and get an actual national representative sample rather than just a wildlife trust people who like nature sample, which is really important too. We have plans with Nature Scot to do this at a nationals level in Scotland first, so that's all looking very exciting. And then once we have this, I want to make that spatial analysis UK-wide base of that data and make the survey tool available to different organisations who need it on a need-to-know basis as well. So this was a collaboration, as I said, with our research group. I just want to give out a big thank you to those. So our main PI, so to speak, our main investigator who made this idea, the Great Nature Survey, was Dr. Daniel Barris O'Neill from the Wildlife Trusts. We then have Chris Sambrook and Rogelio from Cambridge, George from Leeds, and my supervisors, Aidan and Janet from Edinburgh as well. And I also want to give a big thank you to my partner for all the lovely photos that he let me use today. He was going to be here, but he's a little bit ill, bless him. But yes. Any questions? I have my contact details on the board as well, so thank you.